I'm Patrick V, and you're part of the podcast Reimagining Leadership, where I'm focused on helping individuals find a better way to inspire, empower, and compel those around them to follow their lead. My guest today is Tommy Dahlborg. He is wise beyond his years. He has a podcast himself called Strength Through Vulnerability. I love the title of that. And on this episode, he speaks about his own journey and the power that vulnerability had in really being one of his greatest strengths. So let's get into it. Tommy, listen, thanks for being on today. I really have been looking forward to our meeting. Your dad actually made the introduction to us based on an article that I had written in your podcast, which is Strength Through Vulnerability, that he said, you two need to get together. And once I saw that, I was like, this is going to happen. I love the enthusiasm just in terms of us talking about that before we went live on this. And I'd love for you to just talk about, how did you decide to create that podcast as a name? And really, what do you hope to have other people gain from it?
Absolutely. Well, first off, Patrick, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here. Very happy my dad made the connection between us. So Thank you. But yeah, the Strength Through Vulnerability podcast, it has been an absolute blast making. And it's a long story, I guess, to say the least, about what led me towards making that podcast. But I guess I'll start with, I have grown up with anxiety, dealing with anxiety for my entire life. And I didn't really know it, and I couldn't really put a name to it until maybe when I was in 7th grade or so. And at that point, there's still so few people talking about mental health stuff. There wasn't as much information accessible, especially to like my parents. Like, a lot of parents aren't equipped for their child coming up to them saying that, oh, I'm struggling with feeling anxious. What should I do about that? I just continued dealing with it, struggling, being in an internal pain from it. And as I get into college, that stuff's heightened because there's so much more going on. Everything's just at a higher level, the highest level I've ever been at. And it wasn't until my senior year, I'm actually in a relationship with this girl, and it was a toxic relationship, unfortunately, but she actually led me towards seeking the help of a psychiatrist. And it wouldn't have been unless I had gone through pain by myself for so long that I actually would have been willing to give this a shot. But finally I was like, oh my gosh, like this is so awful. I just need to see somebody. And so I took her advice, found a psychiatrist, went to see him, and he was phenomenal. He helped me so much. He was an amazing listener. I think that if you go into a counseling session, you realize, wow, they actually say a lot less and just actually listen to me talk the whole time, when you're really like, please tell me something. So when that happened, I continued learning how to deal with my anxiety. I came across the fact that I actually struggle with OCD, and which was something that like my parents probably wouldn't have known. I had no idea until I did my own research and talked a little bit more with professionals about it. And as I learned and I unpacked more and more of that, I just started growing this feeling of like, I want to share how important it is to talk about these things. Because when I was dealing with these things on my own, I felt like I couldn't tell anybody about them, felt like I would be judged. And to actually be able to sit in a room with somebody who understood what I was going through and could have empathy towards me was so powerful. So after years of actually wanting to make a podcast and not really knowing what I would want to talk about on it, it occurred to me, dude, just talk about the stuff you deal with every single day, and the stuff that you're passionate about. And so that led me to actually doing the podcast as a place where I can share my story, my vulnerability, and allow other people to know that whatever they're struggling with, maybe I haven't gone through it, but they're not alone, because there's a bunch of other people who are dealing with the same things. And it's been a real blessing because I've had friends and people I actually don't even really know that well reach out to me to be on the show, and they come on and share their stories in a safe place. And it's just been a blast, and it's just evolving all the time.
Yeah, it is. And again, your ability to be vulnerable yourself, I'm guessing people that thought they knew you well, when they hear you talk more about that struggle, it's probably like a sigh of relief for them too. If they're like, oh, I've got issues too, that I have bottled up and haven't talked to other people because I was afraid. And you provide inspiration for them to be able to have those conversations.
Well, I appreciate that, Patrick. That's definitely my hope. And I've even seen that with people myself so far, where there was this girl who I grew up with her without really knowing her. And it wasn't until I started putting out this content and actually connecting with her that we realized, oh my gosh, like we both struggle with OCD and all these intrusive thoughts and all this stuff. And now we have that connection where it's like we get each other, we're not alone, and there's so much strength in that. And it's just been so cool.
As I hear you talk about that and making those connections, and we were talking earlier about this whole social distancing and isolation, how damaging that is. It speaks again to belongingness. We need each other. We're pack animals. And I think this could be an event that really has people recognize how much we do need each other to get through the challenges that we're faced with.
Yeah.
We can't do it alone.
No, we totally can't. From an emotional perspective and a physical perspective, like you're saying too, it's one thing to actually be in the room with somebody, which is obviously something that we're all missing greatly right now. But when we can add that emotional element to do and actually be vulnerable and share who we are, that's when real belongingness happens. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Brene Brown's work.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So she's, oh my gosh, I'm like her biggest fanboy. She's so good. And I forget exactly how she puts it, but basically she says like a lot of us are taught, we're taught to fit in, and to fit in, to kind of put a mask on, is never actually belonging. And it's not until we're vulnerable that we can actually belong. So I think you're totally right that this is a time where it's like we clearly know that we've taken for granted so many of the small things. From I wish I could wait an hour in a coffee shop line right now. I don't know about you, but there's so many things that we take
this is
for
awesome.
Yeah, right.
45 minutes for a table for dinner. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. The whole world's gonna change. It's gonna be great. But then, yeah. So we miss that, and to be able to be back in that situation and actually share our hearts more is gonna be incredible. And I think people are seeing the importance of that.
And this is not meant to be patronizing on your age, but I will tell you were so far ahead of the game being at your age, because I will tell you, for me, it was much later in my life that I was able to become more authentic. And I will tell you, at times it's still difficult. And I came from a very loving and caring environment. My parents were very much around image. What are other people going to think? Or, so it was always about how you dressed. Is your hair cut right? All of these things. And it was like a mask all the time, right? It was a feeling of, am I really authentic to who I am, or am I just doing it to be accepted by everybody else? And if you are, you're only going to accept me if I stay in this mold. If you know what's really going on in here, maybe you won't.
Yeah. And that's the most terrifying thing ever. And that's where I say to the people who come on my podcast, it's like, it's not easy to share who you really are, what you really struggle with. But the people who have come on, they've done their work. They've gone to therapy. They've dealt with these things for so long that they're at that point where they're confident enough in themselves that they can share this message. But there's so many people who are just in the trenches of that stuff. And it's incredibly difficult. Obviously, you're not alone in the fact that, like, I know a lot of people, a lot of my friends, my generation, who have been brought up the same way, where it's all about image. And I feel like a lot of times too, our culture almost, it puts so much emphasis on what have you done? What are your accomplishments? And it's like, okay, if I don't have this degree, am I lesser than? Am I not going to be as accepted because I didn't go to college? Like, there's so many different things. And to feel like you can't fully be yourself is one of the most detrimental things to who we are. And yet I feel like that's all around us. And kind of rambling a little bit, but I think that we all have a bit of imposter syndrome too. Like I share this message of strength through vulnerability, and I try to share my stories and my struggles, but like there's so many times I'm in a room with people that maybe I don't know well. And I find myself thinking like, am I actually being me? Or like, who is this guy? Like, he's hilarious, but who is he? Like, so I think we all have a sense of that, no matter how vulnerable and real we're being. But it's just so hard.
Yeah, Tommy, you bring up just a great point on that in terms of this imposter syndrome, right? Because I would say the same thing about, I put out a lot of content around positive behaviors and positive attitudes and mindset and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking of this, it wasn't more than a couple months ago. I think I actually did a post on it, was saying that I put these out as much for other people as to hold myself accountable, as a reminder to what I need to continue to do myself. It's not as though I've already arrived and here's what everybody else should be doing. It's that I struggle with the same things, and here are the things that I'm doing on a daily basis to try and remind me of the path I want to walk on.
Yeah. I love that. That's so real and is actually completely relevant to me. Just like 2 nights ago, I'm laying on my couch just trying to find some stillness, because I think even though I'm always inside, it's hard to find stillness. I'm always watching YouTube or Netflix or something, right? Or working. But I was just kind of chilling out, and I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I share this message of strength through vulnerability. I have some things in my heart right now, and I really don't feel like sharing them. Like they're causing some stress, some anxiety. And I have a little sister right here who I could talk to, but I don't want to. And I was like, Tommy, you gotta do what you say. You gotta do what you preach. And I ended up talking with my little sister, shared some difficult things I was going through. And of course she's my sister, so she's going to accept me anyways. I knew it was a safe environment, but it was still so helpful. Despite how difficult it was, or how much I didn't want to share those things, I needed to, and I felt more free after.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I've been doing podcasts or webinars most of today. One of the ones that I did before we got on this podcast was with a group around emotional intelligence. And one of the articles, I actually still have it in front of me here, it was on emotional agility. It was a Harvard Business Review article, and it was talking about naming, the importance of naming what we're feeling and not to dismiss it, that it's not there. And actually, I drew off of this. There are actually fMRI studies that have been done where they have people that sit in a functional, magnetic resonance imaging machine, and they will ask them to talk about certain feelings, and that part of their brain lights up. And they were talking about this in terms of the importance of just being able to talk about how we're feeling can actually help lower that level of stress or whatever that feeling is, that being able to talk about it is so important to get it out.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with that message. And to have science back that up is awesome. Gotta love that. And, I mentioned something earlier where I said I knew I was in a safe place with my little sister. I knew I wouldn't be judged by her. That's also a message that I share a lot on my podcast too, is that you don't just go and be vulnerable by posting all your feelings on Facebook. You find somebody who you love, who loves you, and who you can trust. Those are the three biggest things. And whether that's a parent or a sibling, a best friend, or a mental health professional, whatever it is, find that person, and that's the one that you want to share these things with, because not everybody deserves to hear your story either. And I think that's really important to share.
Yeah. Are you familiar with a book called Radical Candor?
I'm actually not.
So Radical Candor, believe me, it's not Brené Brown. It's in a different way, though. It's more of what I think is still relevant here, though, is it talks about how you need to be able to be, we need to be able to be candid with each other, but we can only do that. I can only really be candid with you if there's a sense of trust and really of that I care about you as a person. Because if not, if I'm just going to critique you to make either myself feel better or you look worse, it doesn't work. Then it's really, I'm not really trying to make you better by telling you these things, but it's almost positioned in a way to say that it's an obligation that we have. If we really care for somebody else and we want to see them get better or improve or hear our point of view, then we need to have honest conversations with them and be transparent with each other. And oftentimes we're not. Like I don't want to say something to you because either I'm afraid I'm going to be uncomfortable about talking to you about it, or I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. Yet that may be what needs to happen. Like, we need to have an honest conversation, and it comes from a place of love, not a place of, I'm doing this to make myself look better than you. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. I think that's a great point. And I think you see both ends of that all the time. And with all the work you do in leadership, I feel like you probably see it all the time as well, where you can really separate the good bosses from the bad bosses, I think, mainly with that. I've had a few incredible bosses, and the biggest thing that stuck out about them was that they could have those difficult conversations with me because they cared. And I knew that I was protected and trusted, and they were being real with me. And they knew that I was doing the same with them, because usually your people are going to reciprocate what you show them. And I've had a few bad bosses who they were just completely in it for themselves. They didn't care about
Right.
Tommy Dahlborg. And you can absolutely see that. And so that's why people leave those jobs.
Yeah. In my experience has been, more often than not, that is an individual that's either unhappy with who they are or insecure with themselves. That's
Hmm.
why they treat somebody else poorly.
Yeah.
It's less about you and more about themselves. And that's why the name of your podcast really could be it's a subtitle for leadership, because it really is, to me, about, one of the definitions that I will often draw off of is, if your actions inspire somebody to dream more, learn more, do more, or become more, you're a leader. Nothing in there about a title. It's about actions that inspire. And I think part of that is demonstrating vulnerability. I think we need that, and we're certainly going to see more of that, of the environment that we're in. I just believe that is, it's it's going to be more necessary to see that people can demonstrate that. And we jokingly said before we started here, right? Now, that doesn't go to say that I want the person. I'm not going to follow the person that every day says, I don't know what I'm doing today again. I'm afraid. Where are we going? But you want to know that that's in that person's capacity to be able to
Hmm.
do that, because you trust them. Like, I know that if you were to tell me, if I'm reporting to you and you tell me, I made a mistake the other day, or I don't know the answer to this, or whatever, it gives me permission to be able to do the same thing. Like, well, if Tommy can say it, then I guess I can say when I don't know the answer too. We're
Yeah.
going to be better.
Hmm. Absolutely. I love that. I think that there's so much to be said about that. I think that, in my, I want to say short experience, I guess it's been kind of a short experience in the real working world. My first professional boss is somebody who is really incredible at being vulnerable, connecting with his people. And throughout this process of COVID-19, this whole pandemic, there's so much power in somebody being able to say, like, hey, like, I don't really know what's going on right now, and I'm a little nervous. Like, it's weird to think that, like, the person leading you, telling you that they're a little nervous, actually makes you feel better, but it does, because you're like, I'm not the only one who's nervous about this.
Yeah.
Like, we're in this together. So I totally agree with that. I love that.
It's interesting. So generationally, you're like on the fringe, right? Are you considered millennial still? Or are you,
That's a great question. I think it
right?
depends on who you ask. I'm
Yeah.
96, so
Yeah. So let's see. So anyway, we'll just sort of play it as, generationally, I would say there can be a bias that the younger generation doesn't want to work, doesn't,
mm,
right? They don't care as much about doing good work, which I always, it bores me to no end when I hear somebody say that, because I'm like, I've got probably 20 nieces and nephews that are all in that range.
mm,
All of them are in positions that they work very hard wherever they are. I don't know anybody that's sitting around binge watching on anything all day long and they don't want to work. I think it's more an indictment on poor leadership
mm,
than on the individual, right?
yeah.
If your generation, I think, has done a much better job of saying, we're not doing this.
Mm,
We want
yeah.
more.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that from a leadership perspective, it brings out the importance of being able to adapt. Like, my generation is clearly super different from the generation before in a lot of different ways. And I know what a lot of my friends value, what I value is why are we doing this? I love asking the question of why, not just like, all right, give me this sheet of numbers. Let me plug in these, like, like that's not fulfilling to me. But if I know the end result is to like maybe help a family buy a home from a banking perspective, like that really giving us that why, I think helps motivate us. It helps motivate me. And when you see these companies like take advantage of their people or take advantage of their customers, my generation, I think, has been really great about really kind of speaking up on that and like making sure that people know, like, we don't want to work for that. We don't want to stand for that. So I think that the why is so important to us, and I'm really happy about that. And I think that from a leadership perspective, leaders need to know that. They need to be able to adapt and be like, okay, these kids care about this value.
And I think it's going to take some time, but I completely agree with what you're saying, is that, and I would say the generation before you thought that. They were questioning in their head why, and they were probably just saying, this is ridiculous, like this is a dumb idea. But if they had if somebody just didn't say, well, you're going to do it because I'm your boss and I tell you you're going to do it, if there was more of a, this is why we're doing this, you could still disagree with it to some extent, but at least you felt part of it, right? You were involved in the why. I agree. Seems so simple, right? But is so powerful on that.
Absolutely.
As it relates to your podcast, where can somebody go to listen to it?
Yeah, I mean, basically on any podcast platform you like to use. I try to get it out there on as many platforms as possible. So most of my listeners listen through iTunes, through Apple Podcasts, and through Spotify. So,
and is it once a week? Or
yep,
how
once
often?
a week, every single Saturday, there's an episode. And as a little note, it's Strength Through Vulnerability. I spell through THRU because that just looks better.
That's the why.
Yes, that's the why.
Tommy, I love it. Love what you're doing. I have great respect for you just in this conversation that we've had in terms of hearing your story and where you want to go with this. And I'm sure you're going to be successful.
Patrick, that really means a lot. I really, again, appreciate you having me on the show, and all the work you're doing is amazing too. So I hope you keep it up, and I'll be watching.
Yeah, this has been my honor.
Thank you.
If you haven't had an opportunity to listen to Tommy's podcast, I highly encourage you to do that. I think you can tell by the conversation that we just had, when we're talking about actions that inspire, empower, and compel others to want to follow our lead, Tommy is on the right track. If you know somebody you think would benefit from this podcast, I'd ask you to forward it on to them. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, and it would mean the world to me if you would leave a rating or a comment, because that is how this message about reimagining leadership will continue to get out there. And until the next episode, I hope you're able to go out there and rise above your best.